Welcome to our lessons on the last week of Christ, presented for the British Bible School by Mark Hill. Session number 5, The Future of Jerusalem. The strength and the wealth of the temple drew the admiration of the disciples. Such a wonderful building promised safety from its enemies, and the incredible offerings gave evidence to the zeal of the worshippers for it. Josephus, the Jewish historian who wrote for the Romans, wrote that some of the stones were nearly 70 feet in length, 12 feet in height, and 18 feet in breadth. He also tells of the gifts or offerings which decorated it: crowns, shields, goblets, chains of gold presented by Agrippa, and a golden vine in vast white limestone. Its beauty and strength were admired by other nations. In the same way we admire the Taj Mahal, and it's similar from afar off. It took 46 years to finish, and 10,000 skilled workmen are said to have been employed in its construction. As the disciples praised the apparent permanency of their glorious temple, Jesus startled them by foretelling of its utter destruction, which within 40 years was fulfilled to the letter. The Emperor Vespasian and his son Titus, after a 3-year siege, took Jerusalem and destroyed its temple in AD 70. Not a remnant was left standing, except for the huge platform on which it stood. Composed partly of natural rock and partly of immense masonry, it was for the most part left standing. The destruction of the city and the temple, however, was so complete that those who visited it could hardly believe that it had ever been inhabited. And Josephus writes about this in his record of the wars. In Matthew 24, verses 1 and 2, we read, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? He was in the central part of the mountain that is opposite the temple at that time. In Mark 13 and verse 3 it records, Peter, James, John and Andrew asked him privately. So on this occasion, Andrew was with the chosen three when they were honoured by this special revelation from Jesus. But he's put last as being the least prominent of the four. In Mark 13 and verse 4, it says, tell us when will these things happen, and what will be the sign that they are all about to be fulfilled? Again in Matthew 24 and verse 3, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? So, dismayed by the brief words that Jesus had spoken as he was leaving the temple, the four disciples asked for fuller details, and we note that their question is fourfold from all those passages. When shall the temple be destroyed is the first question. What shall be the sign of those things is the next question. And then question number 3, what shall be the sign of Christ's coming? And then lastly, they ask, what shall be the sign of the end of the world? Jesus had said nothing of his coming, nor of the end of the world. But to these four disciples, the destruction of the temple seemed an event of such magnitude that they could not but associate it with the end of everything. Jesus begins by dealing with the first two questions in this section, and with the two remaining questions a little bit later on. In Matthew 24, 4 and 5 and Luke 21, 8, he replied, watch out that you are not deceived, for many will come in my name, claiming I am he, and the time is near. Do not follow them. The first sign of approaching destruction would be the appearance of false Christs. These would boldly claim to be the Christ and assert that the time for the setting up of the eternal kingdom had arrived. We have no direct history of the appearance of such people. The nearest we have is mentioned by Josephus in his Antiquities. But as these men left no institutions nor followers, it's quite natural that they should be overlooked or dropped by historians. Nothing is more natural, however, than that the excitement around the ministry of Jesus should encourage many to attempt to become such a Christ as the people wanted. It happens even today. The gospel shows so widespread a desire for a political Christ, that the law of demand and supply would mean some will supply the demand. As I said, we see it today in our world where people make success their God. The so-called prosperity preachers have arisen because of this kind of thinking and a willingness of people to follow their false teaching because of what they might get out of it. In Matthew 24, verses 6 to 8, Jesus says, "You will hear of wars and rumours of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places." In Luke 21, verse 9, "These things must happen first, but the end will not come right away." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. The destruction of the temple is not yet. Wars and rumours of wars would be the second sign, but Christians in Jerusalem could remain there in safety until a more definite sign demanded that they leave. Of course, the wars that are mentioned here were only such as threatened to affect Jerusalem. Other wars, we might say, will be available around the world. One commentator by the name of Alford, in commentating on this, takes time to list three threats of war made against the Jews by many Roman emperors, and three uprisings of Gentiles against Jews in which many thousands of Jews lost their lives. Luke 21 and verse 11 goes on to say, "There will be great earthquakes, famines, and pestilences in various places, and fearful events and great signs from heaven." Great natural disturbances will constitute the third sign. That these preceded the destruction of Jerusalem, there's abundant historic evidence. A number are enumerated by historians. One, Alford, talks about the one in Crete in AD 46 or 47. In Rome, when Nero assumed leadership in AD 51. In Apamea, in Phrygia, mentioned by Tacitus in AD 53. One in Laodicea in Phrygia in AD 60. One in Campania in AD 62 or 63. There were indefinite numbers of famines and that are referred to by Roman writers. There are pestilences. There are many times when thousands perished because of all these different kinds of things. Signs mentioned by unbelieving writers such as Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, Philostratus, and Seneca, who speak of them because of their importance, not with any reference to the prophecy of Christ. They weren't necessarily believers trying to let us know that something had happened in order to fulfill something that had been said by Jesus. They record them because they're fact. Matthew 24 and verse 8, Jesus says, "All of these are the beginning of birth pains. Then you'll be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you'll be hated by all nations because of me." In Mark 13 and verse 9, "You must be on your guard. You will be handed over to the local councils and flogged in the synagogues. On account of me, you will stand before governors and kings as witnesses to them." In Luke 21 and verse 12, "But before all this, they will seize you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and put you in prison, and you will be brought before kings and governors, and all on account of my name, and so you will bear testimony to me." A fourth sign, then, which they needed to take note of would be an outbreak of persecution. The book of Acts in the New Testament gives abundant evidence of the fulfillment of synagogues and kings turning against the church and uniting to oppress the church of that time. Just read through the book and see them all. Peter, James, and Paul, and doubtless many more of the apostles, would suffer martyrdom before the destruction of the temple. The historian Tacitus bears testimony to the hatred and blind bigotry of the age when he speaks of Christians as a class of men hated on account of their crimes. Suetonius records the terrible things that Nero did, and Pliny writes of these things as well. Persecution certainly came upon those who confessed their belief in Jesus Christ. We're told in Mark 13 and verse 10, "And the gospel must first be preached to all nations." Paul says that this was done when he writes to the Colossians in chapter 1 and verse 23. Of course, the language of both Jesus and Paul must be understood with reference to the geography of the earth as it was then known. Paul's letter was written around about the year 63 AD, or 7 years before the destruction of Jerusalem actually took place. His meaning is not that every creature had heard the gospel, but that each had been given an opportunity to hear, because the gospel had been so universally preached at that time. Matthew 24:10 and 11, Jesus says at that time many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other, and many false prophets will appear and lead many astray. Mark writes in chapter 13 and verse 11, whenever you are arrested and brought to trial, do not worry beforehand about what to say. Just say whatever is given you at the time, for it is not you speaking, but the Holy Spirit. And Luke 21:14-15, but make up your mind not to worry beforehand how you will defend yourselves, for I will give you words and wisdom that none of your adversaries will be able to resist or contradict. This is the third time that Jesus has actually given this promise. Persecution always causes a defection of those who are faint-hearted. We have to be strong. Apostates, those who fall away from the faith, have always been among the most bitter enemies of the church, turning around and hating it to prove that they're not following it. False teachers arose in the church. The apostles testify to their appearance in many of their letters and their dealings with the early church. It was all concerned with having to be defended against false teaching, that people might be turned away from a faith that could probably bring them trouble. Matthew 24 and verse 12 records, because of the increase of wickedness the love of most will grow cold. In Luke 21 verse 12, you will be betrayed even by parents, brothers and sisters, relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. Mark 13:12-13, brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. Everyone will hate you because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And Luke 21, everyone will hate you because of me, but not a hair of your head will perish. Stand firm and you'll win life. The prevalence of sin will tempt and encourage those who are feeble in their faith to commit it. Hatred against Christianity will prove stronger even than family ties. Our love for God must exceed that, but in doing so it means we must still love our family, even if they hate us. But beware, they may turn against us because of what we believe. So we're shown that the promise is spiritual. The destruction of a Christian's body is physical, and ultimately it's not a lasting injury. The one who stands firm to the end, however, is the one who will be saved. There will be death, so the promise must be spiritual. Spiritual life overcoming physical death. The Christian's battle is won by endurance, not by violence. Christ's people can patiently hold on till the end, and in that way, by the grace of God, save their soul. Never give up. Do not turn your back on Christ. Endure suffering if you must, so you can be saved. In Matthew 24 and verse 14, Jesus goes on, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Luke 21 and 20, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. And Matthew 24:15-16, so when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, as spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Jerusalem, the seat of the old dispensation, the old law, the law of Moses, was not removed until the new dispensation was sown throughout the then known world. In quoting from Daniel 4 and verse 11, our Lord gives an application of the prophecy and explains it. The words are therefore the writer wanting their readers to take notice of this part of the prophecy, which constituted the last sign, and therefore the final warning, that they might not share in the bitter fate impending over Jerusalem and Judea, if they happened to be in either place in the hour of judgment. There is a way to be saved. They are given fair warning to get out of the cities and into the mountains. These are the days when all things written of will be fulfilled. References from Deuteronomy and Daniel and Joel. Mark 13 and verse 17 points out how dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. In Luke 21 it's repeated, there will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. It's a pity for those pregnant women because their condition would impede their escape, as would anyone else with an infirmity. The city of Jerusalem was divinely sentenced to punishment for her sins. According to Josephus, 1,100,000 perished during the siege. 97,000 were taken captive. Many of the prisoners were tortured and killed by crucifixion, as he tells us, till room was wanted for the crosses and crosses wanted for the bodies. By comparing this passage with Romans chapter 11, we find that the times of the Gentiles signify that period where the church is made up of Gentiles to almost the exclusion of the Jews. The same chapter shows that this period is to be followed by one where the Jew and the Gentile may unite together in proclaiming the gospel. The prophecy therefore declares that until this union of the Jew and the Gentile takes place, they'll be trodden underfoot. That is, they will be oppressed by them. The history of Jerusalem to this day is a striking fulfillment of this awful prophecy. Mark 13:18, we're told to pray, or they're told to pray, that this will not take place in winter. Because the escape is going to be so hurried, it would force them to be exposed to the weather, sleeping under the open sky and so on. Matthew 24 and verse 20, nor let it be on the Sabbath. Jewish tradition limited travel on the Sabbath day to 1.5 kilometers, nearly 9/10 of a mile. Many of the early Christians, due to their background, still had a conscience about breaking the Sabbath, and it would worry them to break that more than get away from the danger. It is possible that Jesus had these principles that the Jews still held in view. I can't say that conclusively, but in running for their life they would need the support and friendship of other Jews who weren't necessarily believers, who would be inclined not only to hinder them, but even in those chaotic days to treat badly anyone who openly disregarded the Sabbath. The Jews, not being guided by the warnings of Christ, would regard the sudden exit of the Christians as unnecessary and of breaking their law and of something that shouldn't be done. In Matthew 24 and verse 21, Jesus says, for then there will be great distress unequalled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equalled again. These words spoken before the event are verified by the statements of Josephus written after the event. No other city, he says, ever suffered miseries, nor did any age from the beginning of the world ever breed a generation more fruitful in wickedness than this was. And again, if the miseries of all mankind from the creation were compared with those which the Jews then suffered, they would appear inferior. The promise that there shall be no days like it, of course, excludes the terrors and miseries of the judgment day, since it belongs to a celestial time rather than terrestrial history. Having considered all of these things, let's now look at the phrase, the abomination of desolation, that's mentioned in Matthew 24 verse 15 and Mark 13 and verse 14. Taking it in connection with the entire paragraph, we can see first of all that it was a sign practically simultaneous with the surrounding of Jerusalem by the Roman army. Secondly, that immediate flight, even if the day of it happening should be the Sabbath, is so sudden no one should stop to enter their house or get their coat. Some translate the phrase abomination of desolation or abomination that causes desolation as referring to the crimes of the Zealots, a division in Jerusalem, who took possession of the temple and profaned its sanctuary by using it as a fort, therefore making themselves an abomination in the eyes of the Jews. They had polluted God's house. They had entered where they had no right to enter. But a long interval intervened between this event and the coming of the Romans, so this would give ample time for anyone to remove themselves from the city. But as this was one of the last acts of the prolonged siege, it couldn't properly be coupled with the encompassing Roman army, could it? Some say there were two flights described by Jesus, one from Jerusalem at the time when the Romans appeared, and the other from Judea at the time when the temple fell. But the language used by Luke in Luke 21 and verse 20, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city. This forbids us to make the flight from Judea after the flight from Jerusalem. Both escapes were to begin when the Romans appeared. Note that the phrase, the holy place, can actually be misleading, especially when coupled with Mark chapter 13 and verse 14, where he states, standing where it does not belong, where it ought not. The words, when seen in English, cause us to think of some person or something polluting the sanctuary of the temple by standing in its holy place. But it's evident that the words don't necessarily refer to the temple. When the New Testament speaks of the holy place in the temple, it appears as en tu hagiu, in the holy, while the words here are en topu hagiu, in a place holy. Note what the Septuagint says. Two terms are used to distinguish between the holy place in the sanctuary and other holy places, a distinction which the ESV recognises. The holy place, or a holy place. We can conclude that in this place Matthew uses the term holy place to designate the holy territory around about the holy city, and that the combined expression of Matthew and Mark signifies the entering of the city by the Roman armies, and it's equivalent to the plainer statement that's actually made by Luke. The Roman armies were appropriately called the abomination of desolation because, being heathen armies, they were an abomination to the Jews, and because they brought desolation upon the whole country, the sight of them therefore became the appointed sign for Christians to leave the city and get themselves to safety. In Matthew 24 and verse 22, if those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. And again in Mark 13 and verse 20, if the Lord had not cut short those days, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect whom he has chosen, he has shortened them. The Lord is speaking to the Jews. This means that if God had not shortened the siege and restrained the Romans, they would have exterminated all of the Jews. Since the term elect in verse 24 and 31 evidently means Christians, it doubtless means that here. though it may mean that God spared a remnant of the Jewish people because he had made a covenant with the patriarchs that they should be his chosen people. The Jews are also God's elect. Compare that with Romans 11:28 and 29. Moreover, it should be noted that there were few, if any, Christians remaining in the city, and that those who were spared as Jews, without discrimination. In Mark 13 and verse 21 we read, "At that time if anyone says to you, 'Look, here is the Messiah,' or 'Look, there he is,' do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear, and perform signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect." Accounts of these lying prophets who appeared before and during the siege are recorded again by Josephus in his Wars. So Christ warns his followers not to be deceived by spurious or fake Christs, not to believe that he himself has appeared again. This latter warning is further enforced by what follows: "Be on your guard. I have told you everything ahead of time." And in Matthew 24:26, "So if anyone tells you, 'There he is out in the wilderness,' do not go out, or 'Here he is in the inner rooms,' do not believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible, even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather." The coming of Christ would be an event that needed no announcement. Everyone will see that for themselves. The Romans were like an eagle, and the ensign of their armies was an eagle. When a people, by their sin, make themselves as loathsome carcasses, nothing can be expected except that God should send enemies to destroy them. It is very applicable to the day of judgment, the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. So let's give diligence to make our calling and election sure. Then may we know that no enemy or deceiver can ever succeed against us. We turn our attention now to the second part of what's asked. In Matthew 24:29, immediately after the distress of those days, since the coming of Christ did not follow closely from the destruction of Jerusalem, the word immediately used by Matthew is a little bit puzzling. There are, however, a number of ways in which it can be explained. Jesus calculates the time after his own divine viewpoint, and not after our human view. Seeing the word in this light, the passage in 2 Peter 3, verses 4 to 9, may almost be regarded as an inspired commentary with reference to this passage. A day is as 1,000 years to the Lord. The terrible judgment upon Jerusalem and the corresponding terror of the judgment day have in between them no intervening season of judgment in any way worthy to be compared to either of them. The two periods, therefore, stand with regard to each other as bookends, as it were, with an immediate connection. And thirdly, the tribulation which came upon the Jewish people merely began with the destruction of Jerusalem. Other woes, of course, followed at once, and coming down through all the centuries of wandering and dispersion, they were yet unfulfilled and incomplete until that last great day. In Matthew 24 and verse 29, we're told the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. And in Mark 13 and also in Luke, there will be signs in the sun, moon and stars. On the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. The type of language used here is of the Old Testament prophets. We read this kind of talk in many of the prophets. Some regard the language as metaphorical, indicating the eclipse of nations and the downfall of rulers. But there are many similar passages of Scripture which cause us to regard the language here as literal rather than figurative in 2 Peter, Hebrews, and also Revelation. We can think of nothing which would produce greater mental distress or confusion than changes in the position or the condition of the heavenly bodies. Such changes will be followed by corresponding commotions in our planet, as for instance great tidal waves. As it is, people are worried about so-called global warming. What will they make of it when all of these things suddenly happen? Luke 21 verse 26 to 28. People fainting with fear and with foreboding of what is coming on the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. At that time they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. When these things begin to take place, stand up, lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Matthew 24 and verse 30. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. The coming and the sign are the same thing. The word sign is used in connection with the coming of Christ to indicate that the nature of the coming, that is, the way it will be seen, will be fully proportionate to the importance of the event. His first coming in the manger was much more low-key. The coming will give rise to universal mourning among the unprepared, and apparently the majority of people will be in that condition when this happens. The term all is not, however, to be construed as including all individuals. Notice from 1 Thessalonians 4:15 and 18. Some will be taken, many will not. So Matthew 24:31, Jesus goes on to say, and he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. To the Jews, the trumpet would naturally be associated with the assembling of the people. They were used to this. Silver trumpets were used to call Israel together. Read about it in Numbers, Exodus, Psalms. The phrases four winds and so on indicate that the angelic search shall extend over the entire globe. The preliminary death throes of this present physical universe, which will strike terror to the souls of those who have limited themselves to just this material world, will be a reassuring sign to those who look to Christ, who look beyond the things of this physical world for a new heaven and a new earth. Matthew 24:32 to 35. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. Remember the fig tree? Jesus gave a practical demonstration. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. As the change of the season in the natural world has its preliminary signs, so the change of conditions in the spiritual realm has its predictive indications. The Christian is informed that these changes indicate the coming of the Son of God, a change from a worse season to a better season. Matthew 24 verse 34. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So here's the statement that confuses the issue. Surely if these folks are going to see all these things take place, it's all about the destruction of Jerusalem. But some give a dual significance to all that Jesus has been saying concerning his coming, so that our Lord in one narrative speaks figuratively of a coming in the power of his kingdom before, during, and straight after the destruction of Jerusalem, and literally of his final coming at the end of the world. That theory refers exclusively to the figurative and not to the literal sense of the passage. The simplest solution of the matter is to take the word generation to mean the Jewish family or the Jewish people group. Luke 16 and verse 8. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness, for the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. Interpreted this way, the passage becomes a prophecy that the Jewish people shall be preserved as such until the coming of Christ. The marvellous and almost miraculous preservation of the individuality of the Jews, though dispersed throughout the whole world amongst other nations, is the subject of fulfilled prophecy, especially when Jesus had just spoken of an event which threatened their very existence. In Luke 21 and verse 33, we're told heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away, repeated also in Matthew. The disciples had regarded the temple as so permanent, they found it hard to conceive that Christ's words could be fulfilled in regards to it. But he assures them that his predictions and his prophecies are the permanent and imperishable things, that even the more permanent structure of the heavens is not so enduring as the pronouncements that he's making against this physical building. Luke 21 and verse 36. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, neither the Son, but the Father only. These words indicate the profound secrecy in which God has concealed the hour of judgment. No one knows when it will come. It is concealed from all people, so that all people may live in expectation of its fulfillment, and we are to watch for the signs, though we may not fully know the times. They also indicate that either by reason of his assumption of our human nature, or by a voluntary act on his part, the knowledge of Jesus became in some respects limited. They also suggest that it is not only a waste of time, but also presumptuous for anyone to prophesy that which even the Son of God doesn't know. The warnings given are applicable to our appearing before Christ, whether he comes to meet us or whether we depart from this life to meet him. The result is going to be the same, whether he comes and finds us unprepared or whether we go without preparation. In 45, we're asked who then is the faithful and wise servant whom his master has set over his household to give them their food at the proper time. Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants, and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces, and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And in Luke 21 verse 36, but stay awake at all times, praying that you may have strength to escape all these things that are going to take place, and to stand before the Son of Man. The revealed presence of God is represented as such an overpowering event that sinners are crushed by it. Only the godly are able to stand in the presence of God. Therefore, it's our duty to watch and pray, because you do not know when that time will come. Under the figure of the householder and the thief, Jesus noted the sense of danger that causes you to watch and be alert. Under the figure of the servant, Jesus notes the sense of duty that that servant has to be alert again. Again, under the figure of the servant, he appeals to a sense of loyalty. The servant's desire to honour his Lord was to make him so vigilant that he would open the door as soon as he saw his Lord appearing. He wouldn't have to wait for a knock to come on the door. He was ready. Mark 13:35 to 37. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. And what I say to you, I say to all, stay awake. At that time the night was divided into 4 watches. Jesus may here refer to either the duration of the world or to the life of the individual. He divides either period into 4 sections in accordance with the night watches which were so fully associated with watchfulness. This warning message was not for the apostles alone, but for all disciples, and it is extended to all people, so all can be saved. There's much to talk about in the things that Jesus said here, and there's much that you might disagree with me on. All I know is the destruction of Jerusalem took place as Jesus forecast that it would, that those who listened to his words of warning could have escaped. And what about us? There's much to say about the appearing of Jesus, but what I think we can gather amongst all the things we might not be sure about is every one of his prophecies has been fulfilled, so this one will be fulfilled as well. And our duty and our responsibility is to be loyal to Jesus Christ and ready for when he returns. We don't know when it might be. We might consider that the wars that are going on in our world today are a sign that it's about to happen. We might see this great apostasy where even in our schools children are being taught all sorts of false ideas rather than true biblical faith, that it's a great falling away, and this might be looking to the time when Jesus will come back. We do not know. Jesus himself does not know. But these are signs that we should be ready anyway. Do not turn away from Christ. Do not stop believing in God. Watch and wait and be ready for the return of our Lord.